Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Better Managers Briefing. I'm Anne Franca, the Chief Executive of the CMI, and each week at this time, we bring you news and views on management topics that matter. And today, I'm absolutely delighted to have as my guest the brand strategist, columnist, and author, Elizabeth Uviebinene. She is the author of Slay in Your Lane, which was a bestseller. But she's also one of the most interesting and original new thinkers on the scene about the future of how we work and live. And yesterday, I believe, she just published her brand new book. It's called The Reset: How to Change How We Work and Live. And she's got loads of interesting information in the book, and we're going to discuss some of her thinking on that today. So welcome, Elizabeth.
Hi, Anne. Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, okay, first question. Tell us about how did this book come about, and were you surprised about the path that the investigations in the book took?
Absolutely. It was so I obviously wrote Slay in Your Lane, which is like my first book, and that kind of springboarded like my enthusiasm, my curiosity about work, but around more so Black women, and the challenges that we face in the workplace. And then a couple of years later, I was still quite curious, and I have a column at the FT where I write about, future of work and things like that and careers. And I read a stat one day which spoke around the fact that so many young people, mothers and parents and people living with disabilities were essentially leaving the workplace, and and the Office of National Statistics basically was saying that self-employment has been on the highest it's ever been since records began. So that got my curiosity thinking, because I was thought to myself, why are so many people dissatisfied about the way that they're working, and so many different groups as well, not just one group. So that made me pitch the idea of the book. And at that time it was called Out of Office: When Work Isn't Working. And it was that sense of there must be a better way to work. So many people are kind of feeling like the workplace is not necessarily allowing them to bring their best selves and being fulfilled by work. And I saw that amongst my friends and people choosing to go down the entrepreneurship route and different types of things. So when the pandemic hit, it took on its life of its own, the book, and how I was writing, because I couldn't write a book about how we were working in isolation, or like based on something that's has affected us globally. So it kind of changed from it being about out of office and work not working to it being called The Reset: Ideas to Change How We Work and Live. And I think it was such a nice synergy. And yeah, so it kind of, the investigation just took different turns. And 1 minute I was writing about how we can avoid things such as burnout, and how that excessive work culture of always being on. And the next minute I'm writing about how we can tap into the communities a lot better while we work away from the office. So it's a very eclectic book with different kind of twists and turns.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating, and one of your big themes is the importance of not conforming to others' ways of doing things at work, and about bringing your whole self to work, and the positive impact that has on the quality of work. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that, and why is it so important, and how can people begin to do that?
It's a big question, and honestly, I think it's one of those questions that I get asked a lot around. Do you bring yourself to work, and how do you lead, like, do you bring 50% of yourself to work? And it's such an individual thing to everybody. Some people, they want what they do to be very much engrossed in their careers, and they want to bring all of those parts of their identity. Some people prefer to keep that separate. So I think it's so when I was writing, I didn't want to kind of subscribe to you must do this, and this is the best way for you to kind of feel the most fulfilled. I really wanted to kind of write from a place of these are the two options. you can choose to bring yourself to work and bring all parts of your identity, and that influence how you kind of like, do your job. Or you can choose to have that separation and dip in and dip out of that. And I talk around the fact that personally for me, I used to work in a bank, and one of the things that I really loved what I did in marketing, but one of the things that I love about the job I do now is I'm able to really understand my value and what I bring, and that's part of my identity. And I'm able to bring that into the work I do in terms of writing, in terms of brand strategy, in terms of like, speaking and different things. And I think that has worked for me, but I know that might work for me, but might not work for other people. So it's really to get us thinking about, not just what we do, but why we do it and how we can show up in the best way possible to make sure that we are thinking about, how we work in a way that's going to be fulfill us like in different parts of our lives. Because as I talk in the book, there is a mental toll to constantly having to perform at work. And I think that a lot of us kind of feel like there is that level of presenteeism. There is that level of I'm here and I'm going to perform essentially and take on a different character. And I was saying that does have a toll when it comes to your burnout and your well-being, because having to show up every day in a particular character might work for some people, but it might not. So it's just being aware about how these things kind of contribute to the way we work, but also our lives outside of work.
Yeah, and that's a very important point. And by the way, we will have time for questions later on. So if you have a question for Elizabeth, please put it in the chat function and we'll get to as many as we can. But you do say that one size does not fit all. And of course, that's a very important theme in the book. But another very important theme is culture. And you touch on that throughout the book, as well as having a chapter on culture. It's actually one of the trickiest things to get right for employers, and our research found that actually how much you will engage with employees and involve them is key. And I'm curious, what are your ideas on culture, and how can we get the best of culture and the best approaches going forward?
It's so interesting you said that it is a very tricky thing, because I found that chapter probably the hardest to write.
Right.
Definitely, just because it's there is that element with culture, because it's not tangible. Like, what is good culture? So I spent a lot of that time in that chapter kind of saying, we went wrong. So I started the workplace, and I remember I had this internship at a big tech corporation, and it was really cool, it was really fun, and I was 21, and I saw culture, meaning Friday offs and all the nice perks, and my friends also saw that. So it would be like, oh, what's their culture like? And it was like, they give me, they fly us out for a week in this, and we have ping pong tables in the office, and that was
free food.
Free food. And these things, when we spoke about culture, that's what we were speaking about. And I think once you spend a few years in the workplace, you realize like you can have all of these things, but if your boss doesn't treat you well, and you don't feel valued, you don't feel like you belong, and you don't feel like you can turn up and feel appreciated for the work you do, then it's never going to compensate at all. So I think that's why it's so tricky, because it's not something that you can easily point to and say that is the most universal way of like seeing culture. But I think it's important to understand what we shouldn't be so seduced around what good culture looks like. And sometimes it can feel like the blind leading the blind sometimes, with like with the kind of fancy tech firms, startups on one end, and more traditional kind of banks and workplaces on the other end, and one that they're looking at each other and they're saying, gosh, that looks like good culture. But I think ultimately it's where you feel like you can belong and you're valued. I think for me, that's where good culture really is like, you feel like you are basically you feel like you are your colleague, and you're on the same page. You're working towards like a bigger mission. And I think that enough companies haven't invested into that. And I think what happened was when the pandemic hit and we were divorced from where we did our jobs and the desks, and we were, sidelined it at home, I think that really exposed around who had good culture, who invested in good culture previously, and who was, sprinkling on top with nice perks, basically.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point. And, you talk about the importance of culture is, feeling valued by your colleagues and having more of a common purpose. And how have you seen that created? What are some of the best approaches? And by the way, our CMI research totally agrees with you on this point. That's what it is about. It's not about the ping pong tables and the free food. But what advice would you have for how people in organizations can get better at practicing those behaviors?
Yeah, I think communication was a big one. So I spoke to people like Cassandra Strutterfield, who is the founder at Propercorn, a B Corp business that's done amazingly over the last how many years. And one of the things that she talks about is that builder mentality, and she calls it builder mentality, where everyone feels invested in the communication. And there's that element of vulnerability, that human touch, where you, as a leader, you aren't saying that you know everything, and there is that level of transparency in how you lead and why. And I think sometimes in workplaces there are decisions that are made, and it feels as if it's divorced from the reality of how people are actually working, and that can breed bad culture because there is that conflict and tension. So what she talks about is that open communication, and communicating properly, and communicating not too much, but communicating in a way that means that people who you're bringing people along the journey with you. There isn't that top down, this is how it's going to be. There is that democratization of information that you are kind of spreading within the business. And I think what happened with COVID, what was interesting in different workplaces was what happens. So pre-COVID, one of the things that happens in the office is you have all these conversations, these silo conversations that are happening. And those things can be really good, where you're at the coffee, the kitchen, and you have these one-off conversations with people, and that can be really good. But it can also keep people isolated, and information is currency in the workplace. Knowing what all of these things kind of add to an element of feeling either included or excluded. So what we speak about in the book was how what happened with there was a study that spoke around people feel more communicate. The information that they were receiving felt more democratized because it was an email and everybody got it, and it was or a Zoom, and you can choose to come in or tap out. And I think that was quite interesting because ultimately you want to feel like you're not hearing secondhand information via a colleague. You're hearing it from the boss. And I think it had that level of accountability that sometimes people don't feel like they have in the workplace. It feels as if it's a one-way contract. And I think that's what I really wanted to kind of emphasize in the book, that there is that two-way contract that we have to remember. Yes, we're here to do a job, but we're here to do a job where but we're both invested. And we're kind of hopefully redefining that.
Well, one of the things, and you say we need a new social contract at work, right? And it is more of a two-way street. And one of the ideas you consider is the role of the community manager to help foster that sense of culture and connection with others at work. Can you talk us through that idea and maybe some of the pros and cons?
So it's so interesting because I have this debate with I've got a friend of mine who works in community, and she talks about how that can work where you have somebody who essentially is that point of contact as a community manager. But she also talks around the fact that everybody needs to feel invested. It isn't one person's job. And even when I talk around HR and how it's not HR's job to fix work culture, it's all of our voices. We have to advocate for each other. That's how I see community managers. Yes, there should be somebody who has that level of understanding of this is what good community building looks like. But I think for a company to really invest in, everybody has to take that. It's like diversity. You can't have a one person that's like, this is a diversity officer and this is a diversity manager and everybody's on the other end. You have to, in order to bring people along the journey, you have to essentially make sure that they understand and they're kind of feeding into that and they're invested. And I think ultimately being invested into what community is, because these things can feel very not tangible. And I think that that's why we then look to a person as opposed to it in ourselves and say, this is, we're all kind of singing from the same hymn sheet.
I think you've made a really vital point. And again, this completely chimes with our values at CMI, which is, it is the job of every person, and every line manager to be the diversity and inclusion advocate and ally, to be the community manager, right? To make the people they work with feel valued and listened to. It isn't, obviously it starts at the top, but it isn't just one person's job. It's definitely not the HR person's job or the diversity and inclusion manager's job. It's everybody's job, because otherwise it won't be a community. As you rightly said, it's not one person. I think that's a vital point.
And I think that's what leads to kind of these roles, such as, because you see high profile appointments such as, this is the chief diversity officer and this person's here to save everything, and then 6 months later you hear that they've left that position. And there's a reason, there's a high turnover in these types of flagship roles, because there is that superhero complex that we've essentially held this person to a high standard. It's a very hard job, and to bring in doing it for 10 colleagues or 20 and thousands, it's not, it takes more than one person to kind of do that.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. Now, our Management Transform research from last year also identified, as you did, the link between trust and productivity from both an employer's perspective and an individual perspective. And what did you discover helps build trust? And did anything surprise you about that when you were researching it?
Yeah, I spoke to Rachel Botsman, who has written extensively about trust, and she is the Oxford University's Trust Fellow, and she just speaks about trust in such a relatable way. Because again, it feels like people use these words, trust, community, culture, and it's like, what does it actually mean? And she talks around the fact that she speaks to boards and CEOs, and they're like, we should make trust a value. Trust should be at the heart of all of these things, and people are sitting there kind of saying that these things are important, but they didn't understand what trust is. And I think, again, what does that look like on a day-to-day basis? And what happened with the pandemic was we were forced to make sure that we had trust, lack of trust or increased trust was exposed. And I think that the thing about trust is, you're in an office, you're working with a colleague, you're working with a manager, and I think if we have to be treated like adults. It's like, I think that the old system was, you're not trusted, and then it's broken. I think that we always should come from a place of trust. We should start from a place of trust, and I think some businesses and some managers have that intention, but there is that element of control and that element of, and we see that as such a value with in the workplace. We value control more than we value trust, and because we do that, we do each other a disservice, because why wouldn't you want to show up for your colleague in the best way? Why wouldn't you want to do your job to your best ability? And I think that it's a real kind of human, human kind of approach, where we are seeing people as people, not as transactions. And I think that there's a difference between checking in and checking upon somebody. And I think that there is that tension. And when I was in the workplace, that used to bother me, because I used to think to myself, I'm an adult and I should be trusted in order to kind of, you've hired me to be in a position. If you can't trust me to work from home or to deliver it, then what are we doing here? So there is that kind of element that, and some companies understand it and they get it, but some don't. And we've seen the increase of surveillance devices amongst companies during this time, and that's shocking to me. It's absolutely shocking.
Yeah, no, it is absolutely shocking. I couldn't agree with you more. I love what you said about, there's a difference between being trusted wanting to control, right? And trust has nothing to do with control, right? And those companies are trying to control, not trust.
Yeah.
And they'll get harmed as a result, and that's what our research found out as well. Okay, so before we open up for questions, one last point or question for you. What would you say to the employees? I think especially the employees, and yes, of course, the employers that want to follow the lessons in your book, but maybe their employers are finding it more difficult. So how do you do this reset when you're an employee? What advice would you give to them to start to change how they work and live? Oh, I think we might have lost Elizabeth for a moment. But while we're waiting for Elizabeth to come back, which I'm sure she will for your questions, here's the book. It's called The Reset. It's a great read. It's incredibly well written. Elizabeth has a very engaging style, and it's full of actually very unique and well-researched topics and ideas. Now, it would seem that I'm still not seeing Elizabeth come back, which is a real shame, because we have lots of. There she is. Yay, she's back. I was filling in the time plugging the book again, Elizabeth.
So sorry about that.
So our first question, we're going to move on to the. Well, I was going to ask you your advice for those employees, and then we'll take the questions.
Yeah. So what was the question with the employees? Sorry.
So the advice for employees who actually want to change how they work and live, and how can they get their employers on board and their colleagues on board? Where do they begin? Where do we begin?
I think one of the most important things that I realized about the workplace, and I talk a lot about, is realizing that we all have a voice. And I think that sometimes when we enter these workspaces, we kind of default to the parent-child kind of relationship where we are disempowered and we don't feel like we can advocate for ourselves and advocate for each other. And I think first and foremost, to understand you have a voice, and it can be quite difficult to kind of be that lone person where you are essentially speaking out. And I think that's where making sure that you're tapping into the community, you create a kind of community amongst your colleagues, because one voice standing alone can feel quite isolating, but 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 voices coming together, that's going to move, that can move things. And I totally believe there's a real kind of you see that so much in other parts of society. So Marcus Rashford standing, using his voice, and other people coming towards. And I think that we spend so much time at work that we need to investigate and interrogate somewhere we spend so much time, and we do that by making sure that we use our voice. And I don't want to say to buy my book, but I talk about the fact that when you kind of find your voice, it's so powerful when you use that with other people. It's not HR's voice, it's HR's kind of thing to fix. It's everybody's job. And I think coming together is such a powerful thing.
Yeah, and it's okay. You can say, please buy my book, and it's fine. That's great. It's a wonderful book. So, question here from Kelly. Love your take on good culture is where you feel valued and you belong. Great takeaway comment. Thank you. What is your take on job co-creation for those who work from home versus office-based? So it's job what's your take on co-creating your own job?
So in terms of creating your job with somebody else?
Yeah, I think what she's saying is, should you sit down and say, here's what I want my job to be, as opposed to just matching a job spec?
Oh, absolutely. I think that most job descriptions don't even match what you end up doing. I can't remember that being the case when I apply for a job, and they can be that mismatch. I think that there is an opportunity to make sure that you can kind of create a job that you want and a spec that kind of suits your life, because your talent And I think that sometimes we feel so indebted to companies, and there is that, yes, you know, you're here to do a job, but if they're hiring you, there's a real opportunity to kind of, you know, bargain and making sure that you are using your own expertise and creating something that you want to stay in for a few years or a year. So I think there's a real kind of like optimistic time that we are in right now, where we're not just, you know, cogs in the machine. Like, we have hopes, dreams, and ambitions, and you can create that within the job that you want to see. And more than ever, you have companies that have no choice but to, if they want the best talent and best person for the job, and they, you know, to believe that that's you have immense bargaining power to kind of do that and advocate for yourself. And what's the worst that can happen? On, like, do you know what I mean? I think there is that sense of, if you don't ask, you don't get. So I definitely start from a place of looking at job spec, looking at where you want to go in your career, and kind of like matching that out, and definitely making sure that you articulate that.
That's great advice. So use your voice to co-create your job. Question from Adrian. Do you feel that we are genuinely learning from the benefits of remote and virtual working? Or do you feel that people will rush to try and recreate the old ways of working, ignoring the potential benefits for productivity and social inclusion?
Ooh, ignoring the potential benefits for productivity. So it's so interesting, because I was reading a study this week that said that the firms that are keen the most to go back into the workplace 5 days a week, essentially go back to how things were, tend to be firms and companies that are dominated by the men, essentially, which kind of speaks to the fact that flexible working, you know, flexibility in terms of how we work is a fight for equality. This isn't just, you know, a few people who want to just work differently. I think this is a real kind of opportunity where there is that kind of tension, and we have to ask, like, if who wants to regress back to the old normal? Who was it serving? Who was the last 200 years of work serving, and who wasn't? Because you see it with like mothers, and especially in the workplace, where they've advocated for, you know, like flexible working, and they've been doing this for such a long time, and it's only now we're like, oh, okay, we get it, because now it suits. And I think it's like there's a real opportunity here. But to your point of, do you feel people rush and create old ways? People want that. We've seen that with the news of a couple of months ago, and, you know, someone like, you know, our prime minister saying that people are having days off. There is that shaming that people feel like if they're not work, if they're not trying to get back to the old normal, then somehow, you know, you're not really that productive, and you're having days off, and there's something wrong with you. And it's like, no. So I think that there is that fight, and this is the chance to make sure that we are banding together, we are pushing back, and we are saying that, yes, things are gonna regress. There's gonna be some things that regress to how things were, but there's a real opportunity here to kind of make sure that we're looking and saying, well, why do I have to commute 2 hours in and 2 hours out every single day?
Yeah.
Every 5 days a week. I could use that time in a different way.
Of course you can. And, you know, again, completely agree with you. CMI is on the new flexible working task force for the government. And, you know, I think our view is that actually flexible should be the default, right? Mm-hmm. Not the exception. So let's, you know, we have a chance absolutely to reset, right? As the book says. A question here from Dale. What was the most striking learning you got from writing this book? And any sneak preview on what you'll write about next?
I think one of the things that I learned around this book and writing it was just people are kind of fed up with this whole, you have to find purpose in work. I think there's that. It was a lie. I think everyone's quite different, and there's some people who want what they do to be very much tied into who they are and their identity, and for other people it's not really that. But we're told that if you don't go the other way, where your purpose is tied into, you know, what you do as a job, then you're never going to find fulfillment, and you're never going to be, I guess, happy. And that's, you know, that whole hustle culture and that whole, you know, productivity, and you've got to kind of wake up at 4 a.m. to be this type of CEO. And there's a real kind of pushback on that culturally at the moment. And I find that quite interesting writing about, because some people, and I think that's this ascribed version of what success looks like is kind of unraveling beyond our eyes. And I feel quite excited by that, because it's not just about what we're doing at work, but it's about how we can live outside of work in a way that does fulfill us. Because I've got a friend, and she talks about, her job at work is, she really likes what she does, but sometimes she doesn't find, total fulfillment from it. And she sometimes thinks that she's got to, and she's always like thinking, I've got to, do something that I'm really passionate about. And I'm saying to her, but you have so much stuff that you're doing outside of work that you're passionate about. Your job doesn't have to be your source of passion. And that is something that people don't, it's an uncomfortable kind of truth that I feel like we're kind of really looking at the moment. What I'm going to write on next? I probably will take a break and and really try and just like take a step back, and because I totally believe that, to be a good writer and to write, you have to live life. And that's the point of obviously why I've written this book, to make sure that we are thinking about work is great, but it's really important, especially for like my generation, to make sure that we are not just tying our whole lives around, a job, but we're looking at ways to make an impact in our communities, and relationships of all kinds.
So I think that is, I know there's lots more questions, but I know that we are coming up to our time. I just want to say a huge thank you to you, Elizabeth. And actually the name of the subtitle of the book is Ideas to Change How We Work and Live. And, as you say, you've now, having written this book, it's time for you to go off and live some life.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for listening in. And obviously, we will be sharing this on social media. And of course, we hope to have Elizabeth, when she's alongside her doing her living, helping us out some more with some of our work at CMI. So thank you again for joining us, and take care. And thanks to everybody else. See you next Friday.
Anna.
And if you want to join CMI, look in the chat box, please.